everybody, Pastor Mike again. Today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about best practices that churches can put in place regarding donations. Malachi 18:1 says, "Would man rob God?" It goes on to say, yes, you rob God through tithes and offerings. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion today about whether or not I believe tithing 10% is relevant to churches now, if it's a biblical teaching or if it isn't. It's not going to be a Bible study on Malachi. It's going to be best practices on financial management for churches. Churches rely predominantly on tithes and offerings for their income. So it's important to understand how to manage this stuff and the best practices to put in place. And why you want to have those in place, it prevents fraud. It prevents theft. It prevents embezzlement. Now, I know what you're thinking. It ain't going to happen at my church. Do a web search on pastors that have taken money from their church, bookkeepers that have taken money from their church. There was a case not too long ago of a nun who embezzled money from her church. There's all these cases that come up. Ironically enough, the majority of the people committing these crimes and taking money from the church are leaders. So it does happen. It's happened here where I live. I had a client that I was working with. They had a bookkeeper for 40 years. When she retired, they found out that when she left, she took about $50,000 of the church money with her. Now, the sad thing about it, unless you're a mega church and have a lot of income coming in, once that money's gone, you can't get it back. It's just gone. Most small to medium-sized churches can't afford to lose $10,000, $15,000, let alone 30, 40, 50. Sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars come up missing. That's why I'm talking about this stuff, because it's important. Your church should be using offering envelopes. No exception. Now, I'll admit, sometimes I go to church and, if I'm only putting $5 or $10 in the offering plate, I usually don't put it in an envelope, especially if I'm just visiting. I'm not a member there. It's just an anonymous donation in cash. And I know that's not the best way to do it, right? I mean, I'm standing here talking about it. But it happens. Most of the time, I remember to put it in an envelope with the amount. And here's why that's important. If you have it on the, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, but you want to start teaching your church to use the donation envelopes. Even if they don't put their name on it, which they should, you at least want them to have the amount of the donation and then any funds that it needs to go to, whether it's a general fund, youth fund, building fund, whatever the case may be, and then however that's going to be split. Okay? The reason why you want the envelopes and the reason why you want to have the member put their name on it, some churches will use numbers, and then in their computer system, in their accounting system, those numbers are matched up with a name, either an individual name or a household, depending on how they keep track of that. But the reason why you want to do that is for accountability. Okay? The best practice to put in place when it comes to counting the donations is you want to have 3. A minimum of 3. And you always want to have an odd number. Odd numbers seem to work better, but you want to have a minimum of 3 people. Preferably unrelated people, whether they're married by marriage or by blood. Okay? The reason why unrelated people are preferred, they're typically not going to lie for each other. Okay? I tell churches sometimes, and I say it halfway sarcastically, halfway serious, if you can find 3 people in your church that really, they tolerate each other, but it's not a good friendship and it's kind of rocky sometimes, find those 3 people and have them do it, because you know they ain't going to lie for each other. Now, why is that important? Because best practices, if people are putting the amount that's in the envelope on the envelope, when it's counted, you take the money out of the envelope. You take checks out of the envelope. One person will add up the cash. One person will add up the checks. The third person will add up the amount on the envelope. The envelopes plus the checks plus cash should equal what's on the envelope. Now, when it comes time to deposit that, the deposit should match the total of the envelopes. If it doesn't, there's a problem. I tell churches all the time, because I actually have seen this happen, where they've taken up, let's just say, $2,000 in donations, in contributions for the week, but they only deposit $1,750. So there's a discrepancy of $250, which for me as an accountant that works primarily with churches, as somebody who has audited churches before for IRS guidelines, state guidelines, accounting purposes, financial accountability purposes, all that other stuff, that throws up a red flag for me. So I contacted the pastor and brought that to my concern. Come to find out, they needed money for something else. So they took whatever that was. They took that $250 out of the deposit and deposited the $1,750. The reason why I take issue with that, you're not reflecting the entire donations. Right now, I understand why people do it. It's a little bit easier sometimes, but for accounting purposes, for financial accountability purposes, what this church should have done was deposit the whole $2,000 and then either use the debit card or write a check for the $250. That way the income, the deposit matches the contributions, and then you have the expenses. It's a very bad practice to offset the two. Again, I understand why churches do it, but it's not the best practice. Another example of that would be, I was working with a church here that kind of did the same thing. The problem was they weren't always recording the difference either. So for an example, if going back to the 2017-50, if you bring in 2,000 and you deposit 750, that leaves a balance of 250. Now, this particular church only needed one and some change. So there's still money left over that wasn't accounted for. So at the end of the year, their income is actually off by whatever that difference is. Now, some people may think, well, what's $100? $100 in the grand scheme of things isn't that much. But $100 over 5 or 6 years can add up, and it can make a difference, especially when you are planning for the future and you have a budget, or you're trying to purchase a new building or land to expand your church. That $100 every so often is going to make a difference somewhere. And I see it all the time, is loose cash in an offering plate. Here's why it bothers me. You cannot trace cash. Once I put that money into that offering plate, from the time I put it in that plate to the time it's deposited, there's a chance it passes through many different hands. Most of the time, the treasurer is the last person to see it. And they rely on the people that's counting the donations to give them that information. But you can't trace cash. whoever's cashing it can actually stick it in their pockets and it never goes to the bank. I had a friend of mine that was involved in a church, and he actually witnessed that. The deacons, there were two deacons. Ironically enough, they were brothers. And they were counting, the offering was collected, they take it, they go into an office. And they would separate what was in the envelopes from the cash. The money that was in the envelopes that had the name of the donor and the amount written on it went to the bank. The loose cash didn't. They divided that up amongst themselves. They eventually got caught. They eventually did the right thing and confessed, paid the money back to the church, stepped down as deacons, and I think they ultimately left the church because of that. But the question remains, how long was that going on before they got caught? Again, I can't say it enough. Cash cannot be traced. If people want to give cash, make them put it into an envelope and put at minimum the amount on that envelope. Then you have accountability of finances. Okay? The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to donations are the envelopes and why they're so important. Not only for accountability reasons, right? But I've been to churches and I actually have people ask me this. On their envelopes, it says that the church reserves the right to use the money that was donated, that was designated to a fund, whether it's a youth fund, building fund, or whatever, however the church sees fit. Now, I understand the thought process behind it. The legalities of it is what is different. Okay, the reason why they're called designated funds is the donor designates where they're going. Whether it's the general fund, youth fund, nursery fund, building fund, whatever the case may be. One of the things we need to remember, every dime a church gets in one way or another is designated for a specific purpose. The donor has to be the one that gives the church permission to transfer money from one fund to the other one. The church doesn't have the right to do that on their own. I was visiting a church and maybe possibly thinking about being the youth pastor for it even. And the pastor comes in on a Sunday morning as church was getting started and made this statement out loud that I just was left dumbfounded. But he basically says there wasn't enough in the offerings last week to cover his salary, so they had to take money from the building fund and put that in the general fund to make up the difference. Okay? Now, I took issue with that. One, that statement never should have been made public in church like that. That should have been a private conversation between him and the finance committee. Two, it violates the purpose of designated funds. The IRS mandates that nonprofit organizations, tax-exempt organizations, 501c3 organizations, which churches are, use fund accounting. Most people know what fund accounting is or designated funds. Most people get that concept. What they don't understand is the legalities behind it, which basically say this. The funds are designated by the donor for a specific reason and cannot be used for any other reason than what they were given to begin with. Now, I talked to the pastor about it over lunch. Didn't want to make it public. Didn't stand up at church and say, you can't do that. But I talked to him about it after church, and this was a concerning point for me. Okay, I get the fact that he didn't know that you couldn't do it. I get that. People don't know what they don't know until they don't know it, or they don't know what they don't know until they have to know it. So, giving him the benefit of the doubt, he didn't know. The church bookkeeper didn't know, the treasurer didn't know, and the finance committee didn't know. He told me during that conversation that he talked to the representative at the state level of the denomination. And the denomination said that it was okay for him to do it. Now, they probably didn't give him all the information, but given the information he gave me, legally, he can't do that. This is what should have happened. There should have been an ad hoc meeting with the church. And he would tell the church the circumstances and then ask the church for permission to move the money from one fund to the other one. They say yes or no. If they say no, he can't do it. He could maybe take it from savings or whatever. If the church had a savings account, he could have taken it from there. But he couldn't do it on his own. He would have had to have permission. Now, as far as the envelopes go, there are churches that have a disclaimer on there. It needs to be worded differently. The disclaimer needs to say that I, the donor, with a little place to check mark and initial, give the church my permission or the authority to use the funds as needed, should it not be needed as designated. I know it's a little bit wordy and clunky and cumbersome and confusing and all that other stuff. I get that. But the reason why that wording is so important is because I, as the donor at that point, I am giving the church permission to move the money as they need it or as they see fit. Should, now that's the key word, should it not be needed where I designated it. For example, if a church has on their books a senior citizen ministry, but that ministry is not really active, and that's where I want the money to go to, obviously it's not needed there. So they can move it where they want. That's perfectly fine. It's perfectly legal. Okay? Now, where the confusion comes in, I think, is the difference between donations, tithes, and offerings, which is the principal source of income for churches, versus fundraising for a specific thing that's a one-time deal. For example, churches will have a ministry fund and a youth fund and a building fund. Typically, those are ongoing, and they're using it to build the youth ministry, or they're using it to build the nursery ministry. They're using it to keep repairs and maintenance on the building and the grounds. It's an ongoing thing. The difference would be if they're using it to buy, let's say, a van or a bus. Okay, and they're raising money to do that. That's different. It's outside the scope of tithes and offerings. Now, on those receipts, even with those, there's a couple different things you can do. So the scenario that I want to talk about today is this. A church needs to raise $20,000 to buy a van. So they have a fundraising event. And people will donate towards the purchase of that van. But they raise more. Let's just say they raise $30,000. Simple math, they raise $10,000 more. There's a $10,000 surplus. Now, in this instance, the church has a few different options. The first option is they have a meeting with the members of the church or the people that gave. So whoever that was, if the majority of the donations, and with majority it's 80% or more, of those donations came from the members of the church. You have a meeting, you call them together and you say, hey, look, we needed 20,000. We raised 30. What do we do with this $10,000 extra? At that point, the church can make a decision on what to do with it. But it has to be the majority of the decision. Okay, if you have one person that says, let's put it to the youth fund, or 1% of the people say put it in the youth fund, the other 79% say let's just put it towards the purchase of a new van because our youth ministry is outgrowing us. You have to put it where the majority of the people want it to go. The second option you have is, because you should have a list of people that donated to it anyways, because it's still a charitable contribution and they can still get that as a tax write-off. You send them a proportion, you send it back to them in proportion. So if you have, let's just say 10 people, and you have $10,000 extra, you send each one of those 10 people $1,000 because it was over, right? The third option is actually the best option, and that would be on your donation receipts. You have a disclaimer that says any money raised above and beyond the $20,000 in this scenario will be used as the church sees fit. Okay? Now here's the thing with that. It has to be a legitimate reason. Okay, if you're raising $20,000 for a bus and the church makes 30, you probably wouldn't want that extra $10,000 to go into the pastor's pocket as a bonus. Right? I mean, it's not a legitimate thing, especially if he's already getting a salary. That's kind of ridiculous and could throw up a flag with people. It could cause issues and problems and all this other stuff. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't go towards, any type of, I know churches have end of year gifts that they give the pastor and stuff like that, but it has to be a legitimate charge, a legitimate reason that is conductive for the ongoing purpose of the church. It can't be this odd thing. Okay, so let's get that straight. The reason why we want to use envelopes and documentation like donation receipts and stuff like that, and I keep going back to it because it's important, because the donors have the right to claim those deductions that they give to your church or your ministry. They can claim that as a charitable contribution at the end of the year. So you have to have those records in place. The other reason why you want to do it is a little bit more obscure, and I don't think a lot of people know about it, but it's extremely important. Because remember, the funds given to a church are donor advised. They're designated by the person that gave it. So what that means is, as a tax-exempt organization, whether you're a church, ministry, men's group, whatever the case may be, the people that donate to that charity, that donate to that church, they have the legal right to review the books of that church or that ministry or that nonprofit whenever they want to. Not just at an annual business meeting or a quarterly church business meeting or a financial meeting or whatever. They can literally look at those books whenever they want to. Now, if you're not keeping track of the donations, if you don't have some system of accountability in place, those records are going to be off. And if someone comes up to the church treasurer or the pastor and says, hey, I want to reconcile your books with what I've given versus what I have, print me out a report, and the church isn't keeping track of that, it's going to be off. I've experienced that myself. Luckily, it was a little bit different situation. I knew the pastor of the church. I knew the treasurer and the bookkeeper both had some family issues and they were going to be gone for a few weeks, so maybe that part of it wasn't caught up. Okay? But we don't always know the case, and sometimes we don't have that type of, friendship or relationship or whatever with the pastor. We don't have kind of, inside information. But it can cause issues when the donor records doesn't match with the church. At minimum, they should be a couple days off, because if you're collecting donations on Sunday, you may not make the deposit and stuff until the following Monday or Tuesday. Ideally, you would want to make that deposit the next business day. Okay, you don't want to have cash and checks sitting around a church for too long. It's too tempting. Okay? The church could be broken into, and we've seen this with Joel Osteen in his church. It was broken into, and there was hundreds of thousands of dollars that was missing. Luckily for them, they had insurance, and it was, all that other stuff. But that's a rarity. Small to medium-sized churches don't have the luxury of having that type of insurance. And you don't want it sitting around anyways. So best practices would be Monday, at the latest Tuesday. Make that deposit, and then you want to take the deposit slip and attach it to all the envelopes and the reports so that you have a record that everything matches. That way you're safe. That's all I got for today. I hope you learned something. I hope there was some good information out there. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you again, and God bless.